For years, I was a skeptic about the Bible, not because I'd thoroughly studied it and concluded it was unreliable, because I'd heard enough snippets of criticism through the years to poison my view of the book. It wasn't until I analyzed the Bible thoroughly that I concluded it must have a divine origin.
Here, Strobel admits that he never studied the Bible thoroughly as an atheist, only thoroughly after he became a Christian, with an eye towards proving the Bible correct. But apparently Strobel didn't examine the Bible thoroughly enough. Would a book of divine origin advise people on how to sell their own daughters into slavery? Would a book of divine origin command children who hit their parents to be stoned to death, while the penalty for raping a virgin is only 50 shekels of silver? Would a book of divine origin depict its author killing people for the crimes of others? Would a book of divine origin give us contradictory information about the very nature of its author?
It has repeatedly been corroborated by archaeological discoveries.
Ouch! Strobel makes a severe tactical blunder by trying to invoke science to support the Bible. Although archaeology has corroborated many of the people and places mentioned in the Bible, it has not corroborated any of the miraculous claims and has disproven several biblical claims. I'm going to detail 2 of those and mention a few others in passing. In the book of Daniel, we read about the Babylonian king Nebuchadnezzar and his son Belshazzar. We learn that when Nebuchadnezzar went insane for 7 years, Belshazzar took over as king of Babylon. The existence of Nebuchadnezzar has been thoroughly corroborated due to the extra-biblical writings of the Greek historian Herodotus and the Babylonian writer Berossus, as well as the cuneiform inscriptions in the Babylonian Chronicles, the Nebuchadnezzar brick, the Nebuchadnezzar cylinder, and the inscription on the Ishtar gate, as well as a door slab from the temple of Isidda. Nebuchadnezzar ruled as king for almost 50 years and did capture the Israelites, taking them into captivity in 586 BCE. But among the numerous archaeological finds concerning Nebuchadnezzar, his son Belshazzar was nowhere to be found. This led many to question the veracity of Daniel, but in 1854, several clay cylinders were discovered in the ruins of ancient Ur. One of these cylinders contained a reference to Bel-shar-uzer, the Akkadian name for Belshazzar. It seemed as if archaeology had corroborated the Bible once again. But ironically, the same inscription that verified the existence of Belshazzar also contradicted Daniel's claims that Belshazzar was the son of Nebuchadnezzar and had succeeded him as king of Babylon. Here is the relevant portion from the Nabonidus cylinder of Ur. And as for me, Nabonidus, the king of Babylon, protect me from sinning against your exalted Godhead, and grant me graciously a long life. And in the heart of Belshazzar, my firstborn son, the offspring of my loins, set the fear of your exalted Godhead, so that he may commit no sin, and that he may be satisfied with the fullness of life. The physical evidence found in the ruins of ancient Babylon showed that Belshazzar was not Nebuchadnezzar's son, but that he was the son of Nabonidus, who was the last king to rule Babylon before the Persians, under Cyrus the Great, conquered them in 539 BCE. Belshazzar never ruled Babylon as king, but, as we learn from the Babylonian Chronicles, he was co-regent in his father's extended absence, which may have lasted up to 10 years. This explains the reference in Daniel depicting Belshazzar as offering a third part of the kingdom instead of half, if Daniel would interpret the handwriting on the wall. In Daniel, Belshazzar is depicted as assuming the throne immediately following Nebuchadnezzar's reign, but in fact, there were 3 other kings that ruled after Nebuchadnezzar. Their names are Amel-Marduk, who was the son of Nebuchadnezzar and is mentioned in 2 Kings as Evil Marduk, and Nergal-Sharezer, the son-in-law of Nebuchadnezzar, who assumed the throne after murdering Amel-Marduk, and finally Labashi-Marduk, who was the son of Nergal-Sharezer. The 7 years of insanity ascribed to Nebuchadnezzar in the book of Daniel more closely matches the time that Nabonidus was absent from the throne in Tema of Arabia. It seems that the authors of Daniel have left out the 3 kings after Nebuchadnezzar, possibly due to their extremely short reigns, and combined some aspects of Nabonidus with the more famous of the Babylonian kings, Nebuchadnezzar. Further, the book of Daniel claims that Darius the Mede conquered Babylon, but in fact, it was Cyrus the Great of Persia. This is also well attested in the cuneiform inscriptions discovered in the ruins of Babylon. Here we have a clear-cut case of archaeology decisively disproving 3 biblical claims from the book of Daniel. 1, that Belshazzar was the son of Nebuchadnezzar. 2, that he became king immediately after Nebuchadnezzar. And 3, that Babylon was conquered by Darius the Mede. Many of these Babylonian relics are housed in the British Museum in London. Here's another example of archaeology disproving a biblical claim. In the book of Jonah, the city of Nineveh is described as being exceedingly large, requiring 3 days to cross it. If we assume that a person on foot could walk 20 miles in a day, that would make the length of Nineveh 60 miles, twice as long as Los Angeles. The ancient city of Nineveh has been found and excavated in the last 150 years. This map shows the basic layout. As you can tell by the map, the length of the city of Nineveh was not 60 miles. It is only about 5 kilometers or 3 miles across at its longest point, which would take only about an hour or so to traverse, not 3 days. Another clear-cut case of archaeology disproving a biblical claim. Other examples include the walls of Jericho. The ancient cities of the Israelite conquest of Canaan have been excavated and examined at the strata during which the conquest would have occurred. Although the Bible claims that the Israelites blew trumpets and the walls of Jericho fell down, none of the cities excavated had fortifications or walls. The Exodus is another example. If over 600,000 Jews sojourned in the desert of Sinai for 40 years, some evidence would have been left. Countless archaeological explorations have produced no evidence whatsoever that anyone had sojourned in the desert during that time frame. The Egyptian records are also silent. Other claims that are disproven by archaeology are dates concerning the Philistines, camel usage, and Solomon's wealth, and many more cases of missing evidence where evidence should be found. An interesting book concerning archaeology and the Bible that you might want to check out is The Bible Unearthed by Israel Finkelstein and Neil Asher Silberman.
The harmony among the Gospels on essential facts, coupled with different perspectives on some of the details, lends historical credibility to the accounts.
Strobel seems pretty confident on this. So why don't we take a look at the resurrection accounts in the 4 Gospels and see how much harmony there is among the essential details. Let's see if we can find out who went to the empty tomb. Matthew tells us it was Mary Magdalene and the other Mary. So we have 2 women who went to the tomb. But the Gospel of Mark tells us that there were 3 women who went to the tomb. Mary Magdalene, Mary the mother of James, and Salome. Well, maybe the Gospel of Luke can help us out here. If we look at the Gospel of Luke, Luke tells us that Mary Magdalene, Joanna, and Mary the mother of James went to the tomb. Luke also mentions other women, which means at least 2 other women went, making Luke's total 5 women at least who went to the tomb. Well, that's no help at all. Let's look in the Gospel of John. John says that only Mary Magdalene went. We have 4 conflicting accounts in the 4 Gospels right off the bat before we get out of the first sentence of the resurrection story. I guess this wasn't an essential detail. Well, maybe we can get some harmony if we keep looking. Let's see if we can find out when the women arrived at the tomb. Well, in the Gospel of Mark, it says they arrived at the tomb as the sun was rising. So it was early morning after the sun had already begun to appear. Okay, that sounds good. But if we look in John, it says it was still dark. Well, that's no good. I guess that wasn't an essential detail. We're going to have to keep examining this resurrection story and see if we can find even one essential detail. One detail Matthew records is a violent earthquake that happened after the women arrived at the tomb. But this detail is not recorded in any of the other three Gospels. Strange that the other eyewitness reporters would not mention a violent earthquake. Okay, let's see if we can find an essential detail after the women get to the tomb. Let's see if we can find out about that stone that got rolled away. In Matthew, it says that an angel came and rolled the stone away. But if we look in Mark, it tells us when they got to the tomb, the stone was already rolled away. I guess that's not an essential detail. Well, what about the angels at the tomb? Surely that's an essential detail. In the Gospel of Mark, it doesn't mention any angels, but it says there was one young man inside the tomb. Let's look in Matthew. Okay, here we go. It says there was an angel, but he wasn't in the tomb. He was sitting on the large stone. Let's see what Luke says about this. Luke tells us there were two men in shining garments inside the tomb. I suppose it's okay if we assume those were angels. But they're inside the tomb and not outside the tomb like Matthew told us. And there's two of them instead of just one. That's no help at all. Well, let's see what John has to say. Well, John does say that there were two angels, but they only appeared to Mary Magdalene, and she was outside the tomb looking into the tomb when she saw them. Mark records a young man inside the tomb. Matthew records an angel outside the tomb, and both Luke and John record two angels inside the tomb. But in Luke, the women were inside the tomb when the angels appeared to them, and in John, only one woman was outside the tomb, and she peeked into the tomb and saw the angels. I guess the number of angels at the tomb wasn't an essential detail. Let's keep looking at the resurrection account. Surely there's an essential detail that we can find. Well, let's see if we can find out who Jesus appeared to first when he rose from the dead. If we look in Matthew, Matthew tells us that he appeared to Mary Magdalene and the other Mary first. But if we look in Mark, it says Jesus appeared to only Mary Magdalene. Well, maybe Luke and John can clear this up for us. Well, John agrees with Mark, but he contradicts Matthew. Well, let's see what Luke has to say. Luke tells us that the first appearance of Jesus to anyone after his resurrection was on the road to Emmaus, and one of the two on the road to Emmaus was someone called Cleopas. Well, this is no help at all. 3 contradictory accounts out of 4 Gospels. That's no help. I guess this was another non-essential detail that Strobel was telling us about. All right, so I'm still looking for some harmony between the resurrection accounts. Okay, after the women told the disciples about Jesus' resurrection, which disciple went to the tomb? Well, let's look in Matthew. Matthew doesn't tell us anyone went to the tomb. Let's look in Mark. There isn't any record of any disciple going to the tomb. Let's look in Luke. Luke tells us that Peter went to the tomb. So let's take a look at what John says. John says that Peter and John went to the tomb. This is no help. Can't we find one detail that all 4 Gospels agree on? Okay, let's try one more time. When Jesus appeared to his disciples, when they were gathered together eating, how many disciples were present? Surely we can find agreement among all 4 Gospels on this detail. Well, Mark tells us that there were 11 disciples, Judas being absent, of course. Matthew says that there were 11 disciples, but that they met Jesus on a mountain in Galilee, not in a room having dinner. Heck, I'm willing to overlook the location discrepancy just to get agreement on the number of disciples. Luke tells us there were 11 disciples. We may hit a home run here, folks. Let's look in John. John tells us that Jesus appeared to 10 disciples, and that Thomas was not there. This is pointless. Well, That about does it for the resurrection account. It looks as if the only detail that the four Gospels can agree on is that Jesus was resurrected.
The harmony among the Gospels, historical credibility, the harmony among the Gospels. It has specific predictions that were made hundreds of years in advance, that were literally fulfilled against all mathematical odds.
Well, now that we're on the topic of prophecy fulfillment, why don't we look at a prophecy Jesus made that actually failed? There are several passages where Jesus predicts when his second coming would occur. At one point, Jesus tells his disciples that some of them would still be alive when he returned. For the Son of Man will come in the glory of his Father with his angels, and then he will reward each according to his works. Assuredly, I say to you, there are some standing here who shall not taste death till they see the Son of Man coming in his kingdom. Jesus' disciples ask him explicitly, "What will be the sign of your coming? How can we know when you're about to come back?" Jesus predicts all the signs of the tribulation, earthquakes, destruction of the temple, and then he says something interesting. So you also, when you see all these things, know that it is near, at the doors. Assuredly, I say to you, this generation will by no means pass away till all these things take place. And when Jesus was sending out his disciples to preach the good news to the cities of Israel, he told them that before they had finished preaching to every city of Israel, he would return. When they persecute you in this city, flee to another. For assuredly, I say to you, you will not have gone through the cities of Israel before the Son of Man comes. When the high priest was interrogating Jesus, Jesus told the high priest, "You will see me coming in the clouds." Jesus tells us in 4 different locations of the gospel accounts that he would return within the lifetime of his listeners, before the current generation passed away, and before his disciples had the chance to preach the good news to all the cities of Israel. Jesus made the prediction that he would return within, say, 50 or 60 years, certainly by the end of the 1st century, because after that, everyone in his listening audience would have been dead. Jesus did not return within the time frame he gave, and Christians have been waiting for him ever since.
And it contains credible and well-documented miracles that confirm its message.
Credible and well-documented miracles? Credible and well-documented miracles. I can't believe what I'm hearing. The miracles are, by definition, incredible. They're unbelievable. If they were credible, everyone would believe them. Since when is a man walking on water, turning water into wine, feeding 5,000 people with 5 loaves and 2 fish, and raising people from the dead credible? And as for well-documented, the only place they're documented is in the 4 Gospels. Luke and Matthew both copy from the Gospel of Mark verbatim, so that rather eliminates those 2 from being an independent witness. The same could be said for the Gospel of John. The only independent witness of the miracles is the Gospel of Mark, because it was the first Gospel written. The miracles are incredible and poorly documented, since even in the 4 Gospels, the details of the miracles are often contradictory.
The Gospels, which describe the life, teachings, miracles, death, and resurrection of Jesus, reflect eyewitness testimony and bear the unmistakable earmarks of accuracy.
Matthew copies Mark verbatim to a large degree, and Luke copies both Matthew and Mark verbatim. So, this is not the earmark of an eyewitness account. It is the earmark of literary copying in order to improve the previous story. As for the unmistakable earmarks of accuracy, here's a few examples of accuracy for you. Matthew tells us that Joseph's father was Jacob, but Luke tells us that Joseph's father was Heli. Matthew says that Jesus was born during the reign of Herod, but Luke says that Jesus was born during the first census in Israel, which happened about 10 years after Herod's death. The triumphant entry of Jesus into Jerusalem riding a donkey is depicted in Mark, Luke, and John. and Matthew. But Matthew tells us Jesus was riding two donkeys at the same time, and here's the reason why. Matthew misread Zechariah 9 verse 9, which reads in part, "mounted on a donkey, and on a colt, the foal of a donkey." This error by Matthew is because he was using the Septuagint translation of the Hebrew Old Testament, and the Septuagint was translated with the word "and," when it should have been translated with the word "even." And so, due to this blunder, Matthew creates the absurd image of Jesus straddling two donkeys in order to fulfill the mistranslated Septuagint version of Zechariah 9 verse 9. In Matthew, Mark, and Luke, the Last Supper takes place on the first day of Passover, but in John's Gospel, it takes place a day earlier, and Jesus is crucified on the first day of Passover. Matthew claims that the women were watching Jesus' crucifixion from far away. John tells us that the women were right at the foot of the cross, talking to Jesus. John tells us that Jesus carried his own cross on the way to be crucified. But Luke tells us that a man named Simon carried Jesus' cross. Luke tells us that only one of the criminals crucified with Jesus reviled him. But Matthew explicitly says that both criminals reviled Jesus. I could literally go on this way for the next several days without sleeping. So much for the earmarks of accuracy.
As I describe in my book, The Case for Christ.
Ah, the shameless plug. After you're finished with Strobel's book, why not check out Earl Doherty's Challenging the Verdict, a cross-examination of Lee Strobel's The Case for Christ. You can read excerpts from each chapter at the link shown here.
There's persuasive evidence that the gospel writers intended to preserve reliable history, were able to do so, were honest and willing to include difficult-to-explain material, and didn't allow bias to unduly color the reporting.
Unbiased eyewitness reporting. Let's look at some facts. For various reasons, most critical scholars believe that the Gospel of Mark was written before the Gospel of Matthew. The Gospel of Mark can be found inside the Gospel of Matthew almost in its entirety, and in large part verbatim. That's not the earmark of an eyewitness who's trying to record historical events accurately. Not only that, Matthew edits Mark's details, causing direct contradictions between the two accounts. I would have thought an eyewitness who was trying to record what actually happened in an accurate fashion would have been using Mark's version to corroborate the details, not contradict them. I want to show you just a few of these editorial changes that Matthew made to Mark's version. In Mark, Jesus withers a fig tree by cursing it, but the withering takes all night and the disciples don't notice it withered until the next day. In Matthew's version of the fig tree withering, the withering happens instantly. In Mark, Jesus heals a blind man by spitting on his eyes and touching them. Then, Jesus has to try a second time before the man is completely healed. In Matthew's version, Jesus not only heals one blind man, but two, and he doesn't have to spit on their eyes or try twice to heal them. In Mark, Jesus was unable to do any great works in his hometown of Nazareth, but Matthew changes the could not to did not, so that Jesus chose not to do many great works in Nazareth. In Mark, Jesus sends out his disciples to preach the good news to the cities of Israel and tells them not to take anything for the trip except a staff. In Matthew, Jesus tells his disciples not to take anything, not even a staff. Someone copying verbatim almost all of a pre-existing account, making obvious editorial changes, and writing 70 to 100 years after the facts. I wouldn't quite call that unbiased eyewitness reporting.
But the Bible is based on key eyewitness accounts.
The eyewitness accounts Strobel is likely referring to here are the four Gospels. These documents were not written until the latter part of the 1st century and the first part of the 2nd century. That would make it very unlikely for the authors to be eyewitnesses of something that happened 70 or 80 years earlier. And who would wait 70 years before writing down such miraculous and amazing events? Furthermore, these documents were written anonymously. No one knows who wrote them. They were in circulation for almost 100 years, with no one mentioning authorship until we see it happen around the year 180, when Irenaeus mentions the Gospels by name. Anonymous authors writing 70 to 100 years after the event and making miraculous claims that violate the laws of nature don't make for very credible eyewitnesses in my book.
What's more, the early church couldn't have taken root and flourished right there in Jerusalem if it had been teaching facts about Jesus that his own contemporaries knew were exaggerated or false.
And yet, Strobel believes that all other religions are false, but somehow they sprung up, and they survived, and they flourished. Islam has been around for 1,400 years and shows no signs of slowing down. Hinduism has been around for even longer than Christianity. If those religions are false, how did they spring up and flourish? Perhaps Christianity is no different.
So let me ask this. Do you know of any other religious book that matches the credentials of the Bible?
I think we've seen a taste of the Bible's credentials in this video. The Bible is one of the most contradictory and error-ridden books ever compiled. If any of the things I've shown you in this video stimulate your interest, please investigate this for yourself. It's the only way you're going to find out the truth. What I've shown you in this video is just a fragment of the tip of the iceberg. There's more than enough evidence to show that Christianity is false. But you have to go out and find this information on your own. And you can't go to apologist websites to find out the dirt on the Bible. To find out more about the Bible and the origins of Christianity, here are a few links to get you started.